Very much for that very kind birthday greetings from everyone. This is maybe not quite what I imagined what I'd be doing on my birthday, but I'm very glad that this is where I am with you today. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to start by saying a huge thank you to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for organizing this really excellent conference. It's my first time participating, and the discussions have been very rich, and I hope we can continue that in our final session. This is the final session of the final day, so I think that probably means two things. Firstly, we have here in these delegates those with commitment, with enthusiasm, and with energy. So I will ask you to bring that energy to our final session so we can finish the conference on a high note. I think it also means that we have to find something new and interesting to say after the 7 excellent sessions that we have had already. And fortunately, I think we'll be able to do that. We have an outstanding panel today, and the topic that we will be discussing is sustainable trade and supply chains for economic resilience. Now, supply chains have been at the center of attention for experts and policymakers in recent years, and for very good reasons. Let's start with COVID, which had both supply and demand shocks globally, and in the very immediate heat of the moment of the pandemic, we were all struggling to source PPE and then to develop, manufacture, and distribute across very complex supply chains vaccines to the whole world. This year, we've seen the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, particularly on food and energy security and supply chains globally. And we've also seen that geopolitical competition and tension is having an impact on our supply chains. So particularly, I would say, we all saw the impact and the tension in the Taiwan Straits this summer, and the impact that China's military drills then had. So these are very live issues, I think, for all of us, underlining the importance but also the vulnerability of our supply chains for goods, for critical minerals, for energy and food supplies, and for high-tech products that are so key to the modern economy, like semiconductors. Now, an estimated, and I think it's probably more than this, but an estimated third of global maritime trade goes through the South China Sea. And that is also representing a high degree of interdependence economically in the region. So for our supply chains in this region and globally, the vulnerability or the resilience of the South China Sea supply chains is really a key question for our economic security. The government I represent, the United Kingdom, like many others around the world, has been focusing on how we can improve supply chain resilience through policy, through new partnerships, and our view is that we need an effective and open global trading system, which we're not going to achieve if we are focusing only on self-reliance in order to secure resilience. So this balance of resilience and openness is one that I hope will come out in our discussion today. And another question alongside that is really whether this is another area for competition, or frankly, great power competition, as we know, or whether we can really see the potential in our discussions on supply chains to secure mutual benefit, particularly for our economic security. So I'm delighted to welcome our experts panel today to present their perspectives. I will ask each of our speakers to keep to their within 10 minutes, please. We've done very well today, I think, in keeping to time, so I look forward to continuing that. And then we will have a time for a rich set of questions and discussion afterwards. So our first speaker, who I'd like to introduce, is Dr. Tinghui Lin, Deputy Secretary General of the Taiwanese Society of International Law in Taipei. And Dr. Lin, I would like to invite you to make your remarks. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks DAV to invite me again to join this conference. It's my honor to be here to make new friends with us, with you, and meet old friends here. I know you are very take care about the Taiwan Strait situations, and especially after Pelosi visit Taiwan. But until now, the mainland China still have the military drills around Taiwan. I have tell you that because I teach Coast Guard in the Central Police University in Taiwan, so our students always told us that if our enforcement ship or boat departure our port, almost 12 nautical miles will meet the warship from the mainland China, and they always around Taiwan. So that's why I'm here to tell you that how important the Taiwan Strait very important transportational channels for international society. Remember this? This is Suez Canal. The Taiwanese evergreens, the evergivens, interrupted the Suez Canals just 6 days, but make the 369 ships were clean to pass through the canal. Estimate 9.6 billion US dollars worth of trade affected by this incident. So how about the war? The war between Ukraine and Russia. How about the war between the Coral Strait? I mean that before the war, we still not believe that the war will happen between them, but war still happened, actually happened, and it makes some influence, not just only Russia and Ukraine, especially on Africa countries and Southeast Asia countries, just like the Laos shortage of gas, oil, in Sri Lanka and Kenya, their food shortage or the food price increase. So they will make every countries will feel uncomfortable when the war happened. And how about the South China Seas? These very busy channels in the international society, and Taiwan Strait the same. Over 88% largest containers transit to the Taiwan Strait. So if the war happened, so I know this is two weaknesses in the South China Sea over the Taiwan Strait. I think it's very critical for everyone, every countries. So after Pelosi visit Taiwan, and the PLA for the 7 area around Taiwan. It's different from the 1996 missile crisis near Taiwan, because here is another area in the Taiwan and Japan's overlapping EEZs. So the Japanese government is more nervous than Taiwanese government. And then we have some intelligence or information sharings between us. And we all know that the 5 missiles, especially Dongfeng systems, into the West Pacific Oceans. but we don't, we feel nervous, right? But we think about if the PLA really began a war, we have to defend. So that's why in Taiwan, we always say that TSMC, Taijidian, is protect our Taiwan's national interest, very important companies. Because over the 50% semiconductors or chips produced in Taiwan. But you can see the supply chains about how to produce the chips, how to produce the semiconductors. It's not only the TSMC. It's about every country, especially the United States and the European countries. They are a part of the supply chain, especially the Dutch companies, ASML. ASML declared the largest investor in Taiwan yesterday in New Taipei cities. Because why it trusts Taiwan? I think maybe the Americans tell them that to invest in Taiwan, to build the healthy supply chains in Taiwan. Because you know, when Samsung company asked ASML to give them some technology or some knowledge about how to create the advanced process chip, but ASML tell them that they don't know. Why? Because the TSMC have a long history cooperate with the ASML, and the TSMC developed his own technologies, and because in Taiwan also have the healthy supply chains for provide some human resources or engineer or some equipment to the TSMC. So if any country want to copy TSMC model, it's very difficult. Just like now, Japan asked TSMC to invest in Japan, and American the same. But it's also the mature process products, not the advanced process products. Because why? You know, lower 10 nanometers, almost 92% controlled by the TSMC. So only 8% controlled by the Samsung. But the qualifications are different. So that's why Intel or other company trust TSMC. But you can see that above the 28 nanometers, especially for automobiles, just use the 28 nanometers. It's enough. But how about the lower 10 nanometers? It's for F-35, because it's the AI or military devices or military fighters. This is the advanced, and because you search about mention about the calculations or some technologies, just like the Israel, they use the F-35 to attack Lebanon missiles, because Lebanon missiles is produced by Russia. The missiles is too slow because the calculation is too slow. But the calculation capabilities of the F-35 very fast, but the chips is from Taiwan. The same, Dongfeng Systems chips also from TSMC. So it's very ridiculous that the PLA need Taiwan to give them the chip to attack Taiwan. So it's our Taiwanese bargaining chip, right? So the Morris Chang, the founder of the TSMC, said, the TSMC is gaining vital importance in geostrategic terms. So he said the Americans and China rivalry, the TSMC will be the target in the future. That's why TSMC last year prepared to recruit a political science PhD to be their staff, to be their researchers, and the annual salary almost 200,000 US dollars, very high, okay? So you can see the currently TSMC, they have the factories in Taiwan, many factories from north to south, and advanced process factories the same. I mean that someone worry about that they will become the target of the PLA or their missiles. But sometimes someone said that if the war happened, the American will destroy the TSMC. But in Taiwan, just not only TSMC, because we have the 400 companies about the semiconductors. So I think Americans feel that the China-made 2025 is very dangerous because it's not a good hegemony in the future. So if the China will become a hegemony, the first things he have to do that to follow the international rules or international regulations. So that's why now the Americans cut the supply chains with the mainland China and regulate the new rules. The new rules cooperate with Taiwan. So you can see, maybe someone will criticize the IPF is not useful, but for Taiwan, we all think it is a good tools to against China. And I figure out the 1, 2, 6 to be my conclusions. One purpose is to continue our prosperity after pandemic. The second is, the two is two frameworks. One is IPF, the other is United States and Taiwan established the trade initiative. Three is three values. Free, open, and fair is our values, our common values. The four is the 4 pillars, including trade, supply chains, clean energy, decarbonization and infrastructure, and the tax and anti-corruption. 5 activities, strengthen economic competitiveness, strengthen economic cooperation, securing critical supply chains, stimulating job growth, and improving economic opportunities. 6 approaches for supply chains include transparency, diversity, security, and sustainability in our supply chains to make more resilient and well integrated, seeking to coordinate crisis response measures, expanding cooperation to better prepare for, mitigating the effects of disruptions to better ensure business continuity, improving logistical efficiency and support, ensuring access to key raw and process materials, semiconductors, critical minerals, and clean energy technologies. So Taiwan has healthy, systematic, and stable semiconductor and chip supply chains for almost 60 years. Even TSMC promised to invest in Japan and the United States for building factories, but the advanced process products and the research unit still in Taiwan. Not only TSMC, but also other semiconductor industries. This model is difficult to copy due to Taiwan's unique situation in the international society. I mean, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. As a maritime power, I mean the United States or the United Kingdom, it should be responsible for maintaining the international orders, especially should respect for 1982 UNCLOS. If not, the international society will become chaos again. If the country using the military power to violate the rules, others will get together to protect existing system and achievement against the violator to join again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lin. I think a few things strike me in particular from your presentation. Firstly, the truly global nature of these integrated supply chains means that an incident or an accident anywhere in the world can have an impact in this region, whether the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait specifically, and vice versa. So we're all affected. And thank you also for demonstrating so clearly the currently unique nature of the Taiwanese semiconductor capacity and sector, and the strategic importance of that. So I think it's clear to all of us the importance and potential there. So I'd like to invite our second speaker to take the stage. We have Commander Ang Chin Hup from the Maritime Institute of Malaysia. Commander Ang is a senior researcher at the Center for Maritime Security and Diplomacy. And before joining us today, he mentioned to me that last time he joined this conference, he was doing so remotely, and the rain, heavy rain in Malaysia disrupted his presentation. So I'm glad to see he's here in person today, and we'll have an uninterrupted presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, the British Ambassador to Vietnam. I recall 2 years ago, I was a speaker, but it was during the peak of a pandemic, and I spoke online from Kuala Lumpur, and the session was also moderated by your predecessor. And it was a heavy rain in Kuala Lumpur, and my line was cut off. And I'd like to thank Dr. Pham, President of DAV, for giving me the opportunity to be here in the beautiful city of Da Nang. I bring my wife along this time. And also, I'm also humbled be able to stand on the stage talking to distinguished panelists and also participants from Vietnam and everywhere, talking about the South China Sea. This time, I decided to talk about the impact of crisis on economy, in particular Malaysia's maritime transportation sector. And I also like to give some recommendations on how to tackle this crisis. Even though now the situation has been less severe as compared to 2 years ago, but the impact of the crisis has still been felt until today by the people of this region. So I will talk about the current challenges impacting the globe and also the region, and I also talk about some of the crises impacting, in particular, Malaysia's transportation system, and I like also to give some recommendation from my own views. So a little bit of a background. The maritime transportation sector globally has been growing before the crisis. But since 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, as well as the escalating of US-China trade tension and this fluctuation of oil prices, as well as the recent war in Ukraine, are actually impacting our economy. And even though countries in the region had introduced some economic stimulus measures, but now the situation is still being felt by everyone in this region. In particular, Malaysia's transportation system, prior to the pandemic, Malaysia's economy has been growing steadily. Reason being Malaysia being located at a strategic location along the east-west trade route, as well as our buoyant oil and gas industry. But as well as Malaysia is also a maritime nation in which about 80 to 90% of our trade, import, export are being transported through sea mode. But now, Malaysia, we are still have the impact of the crisis happen in the region as well as happen globally. So the objective of my talk is about a little bit about my studies on this impact, and I also like to give some recommendations, and also I like to mention that we have to live, adapt to the new normal from now on. So the challenges of this crisis, it started with US-China trade tension, followed by the pandemic, and then the fluctuation of oil prices, and recently war in Ukraine. And all these are actually impacting every sector in, of the economy in Southeast Asia. In particular, Malaysia, in which we are actually exporting raw material as well as semi-finished product, more so to China. And as a result of that, we experienced some decline of export in that sector. And now the pandemic is affecting everyone here. And US-China trade tension significantly impact the economy, in particular the supply chain of countries in the region. In particular, the shipping route along the Trans-Pacific sea lane, and the crisis is actually has an impact, in particular on port and shipping, and the fluctuation of oil prices. Just a few years ago, last year, there was a plunge of oil price, but now the oil price had gone up tremendously. So now the shipping cost, freight rate has actually gone up. As a result of that, caused the prices of goods to go up everywhere. And now the war in Ukraine is making the situation worse. So in particular, Malaysia's this transportation system, number one, impact of the US-China trade war, in which is actually impacting Malaysia, as Malaysia is supplying raw material and also semi-finished product, more so to China. And we experienced some decline export of those products during the crisis. And now there is a slight decline of port throughput during the crisis, but now it's back to normal. And crisis number two, the pandemic, when it first started, Malaysia, just like every countries in the world, introduced a movement control order, and with the interference of Ministry of Transport, the port and shipping was able to get to normal. However, during the crisis, the cruise industry remained prohibited because of the pandemic. And now the port and shipping operation in Malaysia resumed to normal. And on the fluctuation of our oil price, during the plunge of the oil price, Malaysia in particular, we experienced low demand of bunkering oil, but now increase of oil price, now we feel the shipping cost has increased tremendously. It's also felt by many countries in this region. And lastly, the war in Ukraine, it makes the energy security and supply chain disruptions more important. So I come up with 4 recommendations. Number 1 is for Malaysia to diversify our supply chain, not just to depend on 1 or 2 products. We have to diversify our economy more, so not to depend on any particular supply chain. And we would like to produce more finished products rather than raw material or semi-finished product. And we have to set up more freight trade zone, industrial zone, as well as bonded warehouses along our port limits, so that we are able to manufacture more finished product, can do the remanufacturing, repackaging, and as well as re-exporting of the finished product. I also recommend for our port not to focus too much on KPI, just like, for example, port throughput. Our Malaysian port, just like any ports in this region, should focus more on a logistics-centered freight operation rather than just KPI. And as for this fluctuation of oil prices, I also recommend that, in particular for Malaysia government, to have a more comprehensive strategy in our port and shipping industry. And we have to listen to the view of the people in the industry, in particular the bunker players who are actually handling the shipping operations. And lastly, I also recommend that despite the crisis I mentioned earlier, the world is still very much concerned about climate change. So somehow or other, we still have to comply to international standards, in particular these IMO's standards on port facilitation and cleaner fuel. And I'd like also to recommend that our port and shipping sector must continue to strive for better facilitation and use of low sulfur and low carbon fuel. And the compliance to IMO standard will actually boost our Malaysia's image globally. So as a conclusion, I mentioned that the crises are actually impacting everyone, including Malaysia, my country. And I also mentioned that we have to live in the new normal, and I hope that my recommendation will be taken up by our industry. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commander Ang, for that really interesting perspective, sharing your experience from Malaysia in particular. And I was very glad that you mentioned there the low carbon perspective and the importance of that, which I think is central if we're talking about supply chains, if we're talking about energy security, and how we're going to develop our economies in a sustainable way. So thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to our next speaker and invite Assistant Professor Ryu Young-wook, who is Assistant Professor of International Politics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Professor, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Ambassador, for the kind introduction. I'd like to start off by thanking the DAV for hosting this wonderful conference and inviting me back to the conference. I think the conference brings the right mix of policymakers, international law experts, and IR scholars to shed light on this very important topic. Today, I'm going to spend about nine and a half minutes now on this very important issue about semiconductors. So our first speaker already touched on this. I'm going to provide a broader perspective of this issue to you. And my main take-home message, there are only three. So the first one is, I think we should treat semiconductors as if we treat oil, right? In other words, semiconductors should be better regarded as a natural resource. And I will say a few more words about this later. The second point is that what the USA is trying to do vis-a-vis China in this very important area of semiconductors is threefold. First, US wants to make sure that it secures a steady supply chain of semiconductor chips because the chips are very important for almost everything that goes into the modern day life. The second purpose in the US policy is to reorganize the global supply chains of semiconductors, either by removing China from those supply chains, which I think is going to be impossible, or by diminishing Chinese presence and Chinese role in the production of semiconductors. The third purpose of the US government is to reclaim US hegemony in the chip sector. And here, the US government has its eyes set on the manufacturing. Right? So on all other segments of the chip production, US still maintains certain degree of dominance, but when it comes to manufacturing, the US manufacturing capacity has been declining steadily ever since the 1990s. The Semiconductor Association of America estimates the US manufacturing capacity in the chip sector is only above 10% of the global capacity. The third point is that China has no choice but to compete in this industry. Right? So we've already seen a number of Chinese government policy initiatives illustrating that desire to compete in this tech sector. I think the tech competition between US and China will take on very similar characteristics as arms race. So lots and lots of investment will go into this tech sector, especially semiconductors. Some investment will be fruitful, some others will go wasted, but the two sides have to compete. And the nature of this game will take on zero-sum game rather than, a negative-sum game rather than zero-sum or positive game, meaning that there will be a lot of competition and conflict between these two. All right, so let me show you some graph. So this is the total sales amount of chips, right, globally. And in 2020, the total amount just surpassed 500 billion. Now, the global trade is more than 20 trillion, right? So the semiconductor sector is a fraction of global trade. And yet, I would argue that it is the most critical aspect of global trade because it has a ripple effect for all other things that we trade, right? So, smartphones, right? Quantum computing, right? AI, like other technologies that people talk about. Semiconductor chips are crucial to the operation of these other advanced tech. I told you that we should treat chips as if they are a natural resource. There are a number of reasons why this is the case. Just like we need oil to run the economy, we need semiconductor chips in order to run the economy, the modern day economy, as well as the operation of military equipments. Just like oil, there's a cartel, right? In this, when it comes to semiconductor industry, there are only a certain number of countries that get involved in the production of semiconductors. In terms of manufacturing, it's basically US, Taiwan, South Korea, to some extent Japan and other players. When it comes to the softwares, it's the US, European countries, only a certain number of European countries. When it comes to materials, it's Japan, right, China, and some other countries. So it's not like everybody gets involved in these supply chains. It's only a select few, especially advanced economies, plus China, that get involved, right, in the production of semiconductors. Both the US government and the Chinese government recognize the critical importance of semiconductors. So when the President Biden was elected, right, in the first year of White House, he had 3 semiconductor meetings inviting industrial representatives. I don't know of the White House holding so many meetings over a particular issue in such a short period of time. The Chinese government describes conductor sector as a choke point technology. So if they, they certainly recognize if the China doesn't get hold of sufficient number of chips, the Chinese economy as well as the military operations will be significantly affected. This is a graph to illustrate the different segments of the chip production. I don't want to go into the details. Just for the time being, I want to tell you that there are, depending upon how you look at it, but just for simplistic reasons, just assume that there are 3 main segments. There's the design part of the chips, right, where the U.S. Has quite a bit of dominance, and then there's a fabrication, which is manufacturing. This is where South Korea, Taiwan dominate the market. Right? When it comes to the system chips, it's Taiwan. When it comes to memory chips, it's South Korea. When it comes to advanced chips, yes, TSMC dominates the market. I don't think it's actually because of capacity. It's actually because of the ecosystem. Right? So Samsung can also manufacture as advanced chips as TSMC, but TSMC has the ecosystem that works in its favor. And then the last segment is what's known as OSAT. That's where you assemble these chips, right, and test them, and so on and so forth. This is fairly labor-intensive. Right, the value added of this segment of the chip production is not very high. Therefore, it's the countries of China, Taiwan, and Southeast Asian countries that actually become players in the last segment. Now, I'm not talking about equipments, materials, right, softwares that all go into the chip production. That's an entirely separate segment. But let's leave that aside for the time being. This table shows you which countries dominate the market, right? So if you look at the first row, right, EDA, that's particular software technology that you need, as well as core intellectual properties. In terms of EDA, USA dominates the market. This is the leverage of the US government when it comes to semiconductors. Everybody needs EDA, right? TSMC, Samsung, Chinese manufacturing companies, and so on and so forth. So the US government can leverage over this EDA to put pressure on its allies as well as the Chinese counterparts. When it comes to core IPs, it's basically Americans and Europeans, right? And then as you move down, you see fabs. That's where US, South Korea, Taiwan, and to some extent China has some market share. Now, one point should be very clear. China is in no way to challenge the USA or anyone else when it comes to semiconductor industry, right? However, even then, the United States wants to put pressure on China, making sure that China's tech rise stops where it is today, right? Because the US government recognizes the critical importance of chip sector for all the other tech industries. So it's going to affect military operations, AI, quantum computing, you name it, right? 5G, 6G, and so on and so forth. When it comes to demand of the chips, it's the Chinese consumers, and here, I don't mean the ordinary consumers, I mean the firms. China, occupies around 60% of the global chip demand. Now, this is reflecting the fact that China has been the factory of the world, right? So the China assembles, the materials and stuff, and then they manufacture them, and then the Chinese firms sell them to the Western Europe, North America, Japan, and so on and so forth. Right? So if China cannot get or secure a steady supply of chips, then it's going to affect all other aspects of the Chinese economy. All right, I told you a little bit about the US semiconductor policy, which can be found in American Foundries Act in 2020, Chips for America Act in 2021. Now there's also Chips and Science Act in 2022, earlier this year. And here, what the US government is trying to do is it's adopting an industry policy to support its domestic chips industry, plus to give incentives to foreign firms to build up manufacturing capacity in the USA, and at the same time, to suppress or curtail China's rise in the chip sector. And as I said, there are 3 main purposes. First is to secure a steady supply of chips for the US firms, and this is mainly COVID-induced, COVID-19 induced. A lesson that we learned during the COVID right, is manufacturing capacity is very important when global supply chains get disrupted. Right? So the countries that had certain degree of manufacturing capacity, mainly Asian economies, they actually tended to do better economically during the COVID-19. The second purpose is to reorganize the global supply chains, and this is mainly caused by the US-China conflict. As I said, the USA would certainly like to remove China from the global supply chains of chips when it comes to advanced chips. Right? I think the US government is actually happy to let Chinese firms to manufacture low-end chips for rice cookers, like, vacuum cleaners and stuff like that. But when it comes to anything below 10 nanometer, USA is certain that no trade with China. And they try to do this through export controls. The third purpose is to reclaim US hegemony in the chip sector. And this is where techno-nationalism of the United States comes to the fore. Right? Through its own industrial policy, right? The USA government is putting pressure on its friends and allies to cooperate with the United States when it comes to chips production. And here, we are reminded by a historical incident. So in the 1980s, the United States put pressure on the Japanese government to sign a chips agreement in 1986. Right? That actually provided an opportunity for South Korean and Taiwanese chips industry to rise and become more price competitive. And that's the beginning of the fall of Japan's economic power. So this is the techno-nationalism coming to the fore. The USA wants to reclaim its hegemony in the chip sector. Chinese response so far has been, okay, we are going to compete, right? And we will try to achieve a degree of self-sufficiency. And this is stated in the Made in China 2025. Xi Jinping has been fairly big on this. My honest view is that there's no way the Chinese government can achieve self-sufficiency in the chip sector. And in fact, TSMC founder Morris Chang said that no country in the world can achieve self-sufficiency when it comes to chip industry. My view is that the United States is the only country that can actually achieve some degree of self-sufficiency, but the Intel does not have the capacity to produce the most advanced chips. It's only TSMC and Samsung that can do this. So certainly USA will also lose if it wants to achieve self-sufficiency in the chip sector. China will compete. I think that's fairly obvious. My view is that the Chinese investment will be wasted, especially in the initial period. And I'll go into the details during the Q&A why I think the Chinese investment will be wasted to a large extent. Implications. Okay, so we are moving into negative sum game, right? When it comes to tech competition between US and China. And of course, negative sum game is the worst kind of game that you can play where confrontation and conflict arise to a high degree. I think this tech competition between these two great powers will take on similar characteristics as an arms race. So both will invest a lot. There will be a lot of inefficiencies being generated on the part of both governments. Whoever wins is the one that loses less than the other. And I think my view is that the USA will probably prevail unless Chinese firms come up with a series of innovations that all these other countries have only managed to achieve for the past 30 years. If China can do the same kind of innovations in the next 3 to 5 years, then game is on. Otherwise, I think it will be difficult for the Chinese to win this tech competition against the United States. And I think for the USA, winning this tech competition will be sufficient reason for the USA to maintain hegemony in the region. And this is why I think sometimes I get the sense that American policymakers are quite relaxed when it comes to the US-China competition. I think they know where they can hurt China, the sore spots for the Chinese government. All right, let me stop here, and I look forward to further discussion and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Youngwook. That was a really interesting run-through. I'm really struck by a couple of phrases in your presentation. Losing chips means losing wars. That's quite a stark presentation, an interesting one for us to explore. I'm also struck that you've set out, both the US and China have taken some quite muscular, I would say, policy actions and investments to develop or reclaim leadership in this. So clearly the stakes are very high for both. I'd like to move on to our final speaker, who is joining us online. We have Mr. Agwin Toru, who is the Chief Representative for the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, joining us online, but based in Hanoi. So, Mr. Toru, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I hope you can hear me well. And well, I have some difficulty in moving slides, so I hope DAV staff can help me in this regard. So anyway, thank you very much for hosting all the colleagues from Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. And I also like to congratulate British Ambassador to Vietnam, Mr. Yang Thu, for having a great happy birthday. My name is Toru Agwin, and I'm Chief Representative in Hanoi, JDIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. So next slide, please. Can you move? Yeah. So just a brief introduction about who I am. So JBIC is a Japanese government-owned policy-oriented financial institution. And our mission is contributing to the sound economy of Japan and international economy. And we have 4 missions, and mainly it's 2 missions, so supporting Japanese business going overseas, creating global network, including supply chain, and also environmental preservation, so decarbonization and all that. Next slide, please. So today's I think topic for me is how Japanese business see or policymakers see in terms of how we can create a more resilient supply chain in Asia. And there are some approaches, like initial approaches being made. So I'd just like to introduce from the ground level. Supply chain. So it's far behind the Belt Road Initiative was started. Japan has actively worked on providing infrastructure in Asia, and also for Japanese companies to create industrial supply chain in Asia. So you can see long ago, 1980s, yen appreciation was the factor for Japanese companies to go out of Japan because of the deteriorating export competitiveness. And then in the 1990s, automobile electronics sector, primarily in Asia, global production network was created. And also host country was taking advantage of this opportunity to utilize Japanese official development assistance and to make, put together with FDI to make a so-called export-oriented industrialization. So it made, long time ago, what's called East Asian miracle. And after maybe 2000s, I think these countries, in particular China, became a giant, not in terms of production, but also in terms of the consumers. And following that, ASEAN countries with several hundred millions of people, of consumers, followed to grow as a consuming market as well, in addition to the production market. So that's why the FDI driven to the domestic demand grew. And nowadays, what's called a gravity model, referring to the size of the market, as well as the distance between the market and production site is becoming more important. As you can see, Toyota production is a good example to show that after Japan, not yet, after Japan, China and other Asia has a very big share, and put together Asian supply chain has like 60% of the total production globally. So going to next, the challenges about supply chain. So I think it's pretty much well known to you. So just looking back, but so greater complexity and instability is now seen by COVID-19, US-China relations, and recent Russian-Ukrainian war, and increased ESG requirements. Then these are impacting supply chain on increased production transportation cost, shortage in parts, raw materials, disorder in logistics, and labor force shortages. So let us look into more specific impact. Next slide, please. So this is based on our survey, JBIC survey on Japanese manufacturing. And so when we listen to the voices of Japanese manufacturing regarding the impact of US-China decoupling, at least until 2021, they say that no discussion was made whether they should decouple the supply chain between US and China. So they have not yet decided. And this trend seems to continue in this year's survey, which is going to be launched in December next month. Next slide, please. And at the same time, when we asked the Japanese manufacturing how they're going to expand business, whether it's in China or US, so roughly half of the answer went to both. So they're going to increase the capacity both in US and China. So in this way, Japanese manufacturing is having a kind of neutral position, or to place importance on the both markets at this moment in time. Next slide, should I please? Yeah, thank you. But I think what's been having a bigger impact on the Japanese supply chain as well as global supply chain is, I think, China lockdown. And I've learned from my colleague based in Beijing that according to the survey by US Chamber of Commerce in China last year, 66% of respondents intended to expand the operation in China, so which was like positive attitude still. However, after the China lockdown, Shanghai lockdown in February, according to EU Chamber of Commerce survey in May, 23% of respondents said they're planning to shift FDI away from China in terms of new investments. And even more, some 80% of respondents think China as attractive as FDI destination went down. So it's more of lockdown impact now being seen in terms of the short term at least. And also, of course, Russia-Ukraine war is having an impact, but it's still indirect in terms of fuel price, logistics, exchange rate, and all those factors, not directly at this moment seems to be impacting at least Japanese manufacturing when we did the survey. So next slide, please. So how business is moving? So we are aware that the Chinese market is very attractive as in terms of production, but the companies are now reconfiguring the supply chain and trying to pluralize the production, and they're doing like relocation in some ways from the perspective of economic efficiency and greater resilience. So for example, the recently Uniqlo supplier, such as sewing manufacturers or Nintendo Switch suppliers are already moving some of their production function from China to Vietnam. And in addition, it's not only China, but for example, as you can see, Panasonic Thailand manufacturing base for refrigerator or washing machine went from Thai to Vietnam. So how the Japanese companies are looking in terms of the attractiveness of the new location. So this is also our survey result for Japanese manufacturing. And as yellow highlighted, Vietnam is currently seen as the top most attractive destination within ASEAN. China and India are different markets in this sense, but Vietnam is now gaining more momentum. And the background being, next slide, please. Yeah, market growth potential, it's same for every promising countries, but other factors include human resources and political social stability, as well as being an outlet as supply chain risk diversification. So it's been the clear motivation which is growing at this moment in time. But at the other hand, the host country needs to develop the local industry, and this kind of effort needs to be made both from FDI and host country side. So we're going to the next slide. So enhancing regional supply chain and resilience can be enhanced, I think, through the efforts by FDI corporates, FDI home countries such as Japan, and host country, and collaboration among like-minded partners. So can you go to the next slide? As an example, on the side of manufacturers, so Toyota is now doing support to develop local supporting industry. So Vietnam is seen as a promising site, but local supporting industry is relatively weak. So according to like JETRO research, Thai local procurement rate is something like 60%, while Vietnam is 37%. So it's still low. And even more, that such local procurement involves foreign FDI local suppliers. So pure local suppliers are pretty much minimal. So that's why Toyota went to development of the local supply chain by trying to grow the local suppliers. So Japanese leading companies are doing this kind of efforts. In addition, as you can see in the current slide, so JVIC is also supporting an investment of Japanese companies into Asia, not only Vietnam, but just as Vietnam, 200 or more transactions have already made in terms of SME, Japanese SME investments in Vietnam. So this is not only like creating like labor opportunities, but also like maybe Japanese manufacturing method is going to be transferred through those activities. And furthermore, we're not only now supporting Japanese manufacturing, but also in the case of India, we are also supporting Indian suppliers to Japanese, let's say, multi-Suzuki manufacturer or their retail supply chains who are composed by the Indian local companies. And in addition, we're also trying to support greener supply chain. In the case of Vietnam, currently what I'm working on is to help manufacturing industry introduce rooftop solar so that they can increase greenization of their supply chain. So finally, we are in a larger level of cooperation. So now, like IPEF concept is being discussed for free and open in the Pacific or others, to including supply chain resilience and clean economy transition. So based on these trends, or taking those kind of trends proactively, JVIC is also working together with like-minded partners, including US and Australia, to promote this kind of like a collaboration in supply chain resilience and greenization of the supply chain. So in the end, Japan is trying to like promote positive sum game, let's say, within Asia region to make the supply chain more resilient, working together with the FDI provider, host country, and like-minded partners. I hope this kind of ground level information will help you think and discuss more about grant strategy or policy research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toru, for that excellent presentation and perspective of Japanese business and investors, and a helpful reminder to us all that supply chains in any case are constantly reconfiguring and reforming themselves based on a whole range of different factors. So we have some time now for questions, and I would like to start the discussion with hands in the room. So can I ask those with questions, please put their hands up, and when you come in, please state your name and affiliation, and of course, who you would like to address your questions to. Let's start over here. Lady back here, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Big Chen with IC's Youth Research Institute and also CSIS in Washington, D.C. So I would like to have a question for both Dr. Ryu Yong-gok and also Dr. Cheng Hyu Lin. So because right now Taiwan is considered the largest producer of semiconductors, and in my understanding is that Taiwan still has the know-how and advantage to keep its competitiveness in the next 5 to 6 years. But in your opinion, is there any country in the region could replace Taiwan after that time period? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation for all the four speakers. I have a question and a little comment and a question. We have 2 out of 4 speakers talking about supply chain on semiconductors. Is it a kind of coincidence that you choose the topic by yourself or ordered by the organizers? The second thing that it seems to be that both of you forecast that in the race between China and US in the production of semiconductors, you said it very unlikely China will win the race. So how do you think about the implication for South China Sea if China lose the race? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take one more question in the room before going. Yes, please, Professor.
A question to Assistant Professor Ryo. You explained very well how Japan, which previously was a major actor and producer of semiconductors, how it lost its lead because of this agreement with the United States, and since then it lost out to South Korea and Taiwan, etc. And my question is, what is Japan doing to regain that lead? And I ask that question because I've noted that over the years there have been various efforts in Japan to revitalize the semiconductor industry, and quite recently it was reported in Mainichi, I believe, that under the Kishida government there's an initiative to gather together certain companies to invest in the revitalization of Japan's semiconductor industry. So my question is, from your perspective, what would be the success of this initiative?
Thank you very much. Semiconductors are the hot topic. So can I start with Dr. Lin, please, and then Professor Yongwook? I think all 3 questions were relevant to both of you.
Okay, first questions I want to answer is, stay in Taiwan, TSMC have advanced process products, but invest in Americans is a mature process products. The same as that in Japan, maybe 28 nanometers. In Nanjing, in mainland China, still have the TSMC factory, but still 28 nanometers. So it means that advanced is for satellite, for AI, for fighters, or for any high technologies. But the normal nanometers is just for automobiles or for computers. But the just such as the 7 nanometers is for Apple smartphone. So I mean that the TSMC have the strategies to invest all over the world. So right now, the American government has asked TSMC not to provide lower 14 nanometers to mainland China. So they can have the 28 nanometers, but cannot lower 14 nanometers. Why? Because they want to cut their capabilities to develop the high technology military industry. Because if mainland China have this skill or technologies, it will over the Americans become a superpower in the world in the future. So that's why now Americans maybe use the 10 years or to 20 years to reorganize the old supply chains to prevent the mainland China become a hegemony. And I have to answer the second question is that I choose myself because the organizers just asked me talk about the supply chain and the economic resilience. But if the chips are interrupted by just like the military drills or war or any CNS interrupted, so maybe all factors, especially the automobiles, because last year the German economic ministers write a letter to Taiwan, and the American senators also write letters to Taiwan, and Canada's for all Ford, Auto, or Benz, or BMW, or for their automobiles factories, because they no chips, no chips, so they cannot produce their cars. So there were some job losses. So I mean that it will affect any country's economy. So that's why they ask Taiwan to provide the chips stably. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. So let me deal with the first one. So which country can replace Taiwan? I think the answer is any country can replace Taiwan. Now that is probably a surprise response to you. I think the critical issue is at what cost and at what expense, right? So for example, if you use any iPhone, right, the 5 nanometer chips will be in your latest iPhone. 2 years ago, it was 7 nanometer. Now, using the iPhone with the 7 nanometer chips versus using an iPhone with 5 nanometer chips, does that make any difference in your life? Probably not. Right? So if you can live with 7 nanometer, then yeah, you can replace Taiwan or TSMC, so long as you don't need these 5 nanometers, right? Of course, right, if you want to get hold of the most advanced chips that can produce the best performance for your military equipment, the AI, right? If you need to process a large amount of data, then, and in a fast period of time, then you do need the most advanced chips, right? So then, no one can replace TSMC. I think Samsung is probably the only firm that can replace it, but where Samsung lags behind TSMC is having the kind of rich ecosystem which takes care of the design right down to the low end of the chip production. To your question, I think DAV respects individual freedom and academic freedom. So I was the one determining my own topic for presentation. It just coincided that because all of us think that the semiconductors are very important when it comes to supply chains. Now, implications for the South China Sea. It's very hard to give you a concrete answer here. So just like what I said just now, having the most advanced chips is one thing. Making use of them is a completely another thing. Right? So let's say you can envision certain military operations in the South China Sea which require the use of these most advanced chips. Then USA will have an upper hand, right? If it can cut out China from accessing these advanced chips. But if the operations do not require the most advanced chips, then yeah, it's not going to give any advantage to the United States. So I guess it depends on how you envision your operations, right, and whether those chips can be useful for those operations. By the way, the Chinese firm, known as SMIC, does have certain degree of capacity when it comes to chip manufacturing. So, even though the United States is preventing external firms from trading with Chinese firms when it comes to any chips below 14 nanometer, but SMIC can manufacture up to 7 nanometer. Very recently, only a few months ago, there was a revelation that SMIC claims that it has successfully manufactured 5 nanometer chips without using the EUV equipment, where the ASML, the Dutch company, has monopoly, in the world. So the SMIC was claiming that using the old equipment, not the latest one, it's still successfully manufactured 5 nanometer chips. I found it a little bit difficult to trust, that claim. And I'm not an engineer, by the way, but there's some independent report coming out of a Canadian firm which actually tests that those chips, 5 nanometer chips manufactured by SMIC, were as good as TSMC 5 nanometer chips. Now, the problem is the yield rate is not up to the standard. So in other words, you can invest $1 billion just to produce one 5-nanometer chip, for example. I mean, that's a waste of money, right? So, if you invest money, there's got to be corresponding output that comes out of the investment. I don't think SMIC is at that stage. Therefore, hardly anybody gets too concerned about SMIC's claim. About Japan, yes. So the Japanese government, with the United States, is collaborating on chip design. It's collaborating with Taiwanese government, right? Giving subsidies for TSMC to set up factories. As far as I know, these new chip factories in Japan set up by TSMC are not going to manufacture the most advanced chips. I think those chips are going to go into the automobiles, and usually they're going to be 50 nanometer, 20 nanometer, right? Sort of medium-end chips. And here, the Japanese government purpose is pretty obvious: to secure steady supply of chips for their automobile industry. It's not about military equipment. It's not about regaining, right, chip dominance and so on and so forth. And this is a lesson that everybody has to learn. Once you lag behind in the most advanced tech sector, it becomes exceedingly difficult for you to catch up, right? I mean, there's an argument in the IPE which says late industrializers have certain advantage, right? Because they can learn from the mistakes of the earlier ones, right? Therefore, they don't waste their energy or resources as much. Therefore, they can play the catch-up game fairly quickly. I think when it comes to most advanced, right, tech industries, that doesn't apply. Right? And therefore, that's why Samsung, TSMC invest tens of $billions every year just to stay 1 nanometer ahead of each other, right? I mean, that's the kind of investment they are making to stay competitive, right, and stay 1 nanometer ahead of everybody else. And Japan, I think, when it comes to manufacturing, is already lagging behind. Unless the Japanese government is willing to bet a lot of money. I'm not talking about like tens of $billions. I'm talking about hundreds of $billions. Even then, I have some question mark whether that's going to be successful.
Thank you very much, Professor. I wonder if Mr. Toru would like to come in on this question as well of Japan's investment and interest in particularly the higher end, lower nanometer scale of semiconductor production.
Okay, thank you. Not that much of a specialist in semiconductor industry, but what I learned from the recent news is that, as other panelists has correctly pointed out, Japanese government has now drawn up their own strategy, and one being introducing TSMC to Kumamoto, in the Kyushu area, to produce like medium level 12 up to 28 nanometer semiconductor. And beyond that, the news just opened last week was that there will be a new entity, company to be developed to pursue, to produce 2 nanometer level new generation semiconductor. The name of the company named Rapidus, and it's been led by former Tokyo Electron CEO, and then be sponsored by Toyota and NTT and key Japanese companies who really need these high-end semiconductor chips with backup, with the support from the Japanese government financing. It's not foreseen when they're going to really produce the real high-end ones, but it's been reported that 2027 is the target year that they're going to produce such the most high-end ones. So I'm not sure what is going to happen in reality, but that's been reported, and that's being catching eyes in Japan as hot news. So that's what I can share at this moment in time with you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to a couple of the online questions that we've received, and I'll start with one which is for the whole panel, and welcome responses from any of our panel. Given the Ukraine crisis, players like the US and EU are considering making products at home to be less dependent on China or other countries, despite their cheap labor forces. What are the impacts for ASEAN countries, including Vietnam, And what should ASEAN do to secure a firm positive in the supply chain? And a second question for Dr. Lin. There are some suggestions that China will hesitate to attack Taiwan because of the risk of losing the supply of semiconductor products. Do you agree or disagree with this idea? Dr. Lin, do you want to take that one on first?
This answer is very difficult because in Taiwan, we discussed this before. You can see the mainland China always use the economic embargo to Taiwan, especially the agriculture's food or products, especially 2 years ago, pineapples, and then the wax apple, and then other fruits, any fruits. But never heard that we want to have the economic embargo for Taiwan for cheap. So this in Taiwan, we always have a joke like, if you buy ours pineapples one, and we're gonna give you a one cheap. So you embargo it or not. But the other way is that we have the memories, and you can come back to the World War II, when Americans cut any supply chains of Japan, and the Pacific War happened. So if the Americans cut the Chinese any supply chains, it let China become chaos, or become their regimes have a problem. So we have to understand that maybe war still possible happen. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Do any of our panel members want to come back on the first question on reshoring possibilities? Yes, please. Commander Ang.
I'd like to give my view on now that FDI are expected to come to ASEAN countries in a big way. So I would like to suggest that ASEAN countries must prepare for this big investment in which I would think that our focus should be on human resource development and education, and followed by technology and innovation, and lastly on the prepare for our infrastructure, upgrade of our infrastructure, so that we are able to adapt and to facilitate the FDI coming to Southeast Asia in a big way. Thank you.
I'll be brief in my remarks this time. I forgot to mention something. So, I mean, ideally, you wanna be in a position to be able to manufacture these advanced chips, right? So that you don't have to depend upon anybody else. That's going to reduce your vulnerability. And that's what a lot of countries, especially big ones, are trying to do. I don't think that's the way we should go, right? I mean, the main benefits of constructing supply chains is to increase efficiency, right, throughout the entire process. So if you try to do everything on your own, obviously that's not, right, going to be economically beneficial. So whether it's Japan or India or EU or USA trying to do it on their own, then I don't think it's the right approach. I think what they should try to do is to ensure a trusted network when it comes to supply chains, right? And this is where USA has enormous advantage over China. I mean, in this conference, we talked about the credibility of the Chinese government, the lack of mutual trust between China and neighboring countries. United States, even though there are some misgivings on the part of regional countries towards the United States, at least the US government is more trusted than the Chinese government, and securing a trusted network when it comes to constructing manufacturing chips. I think that's the way Japan, right, India, EU, and other countries should think about. But the Taiwan issue, I think I've heard this discussion about, maybe CCP wants to invade Taiwan because it wants to take over TSMC. Now the question is, what if it invades Taiwan? Then that's going to destroy the semiconductor industry and so on and so forth. I think this is over-exaggerated, like over-inflated. I don't think Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning and thinks about TSMC and therefore whether I should invade Taiwan or not. I don't think it's part of his consideration at all. And even if China invades Taiwan, and I think it's a distant possibility, and it takes over Taiwan successfully, which I think it's going to be very, very difficult, it's not he's not going to get any advantage from controlling TSMC. I mean, this is a rather very simplistic approach to this technology. Just because you get hold of the factory doesn't mean that you can manufacture the kind of chips that the TSMC workers are manufacturing today. So, that would be my response to that question.
Thank you very much, Professor. I want to make sure that we wrap up on time for everyone, but I want to give also the opportunity for people in the room to ask 2 more questions. So, hands, please. Yes, gentleman back here.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm Lê Hồng Hiệp, a senior fellow at the ISIS Social Research Institute in Singapore. I have 2 questions. The first goes to Mr. Aguentoru. I was impressed by your slide on why is Vietnam promising. It seems the respondents to the JBIC survey are very positive about Vietnam, and in the 4 questions or 4 areas that you asked them, Vietnam ranks very high, only number 3 regarding market growth potential, but it ranks number 1 in outlet as supply chain risk diversification, excellent human resources, and political and social stability. And it struck me that they consider Vietnam's human resources as excellent and ranks better, higher than human resources in some other countries. So my question is, can you please share with us the methodology of the survey? What is the population of the survey? Because I suspect that there may be some bias towards Vietnam here. So if you can share with us some information about the survey, that is very much appreciated. My second question goes to Dr. Lin. As Professor Ryu mentioned earlier, the U.S. is trying to reclaim its chip or semiconductor hegemony. And one of the things the U.S. is doing is to ask chips manufacturers to set up their manufacturing facilities in America. And we know that TSMC has already set up a big factory in the U.S. already. And recently I heard that Apple is also asking TSMC to produce its high-end chips in America, not in Taiwan. So my question is, what is implication for Taiwan? Because we know that if Taiwan can retain all its high-end chip manufacturing capabilities in Taiwan, that will work in its advantage. But if these facilities are moving to somewhere else, it's not going to be good for Taiwan. So how do you see this challenge, and how is Taiwan responding to this challenge? Thank you.
Thank you. Any final question? No, well, we have 2 excellent questions there. Thank you. So, Mr. Toru, do you want to respond to the first one, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for showing an interest to JB survey. And it's actually nothing biased to Vietnam. And I'm just lucky being here in Vietnam to present this survey to many people. But so as for the methodology, well, this survey itself is a very long-standing survey conducted over 30 years. And it's being very renowned in Japanese community and also foreign community. So we share this report every year. And it's also available through our website. But the methodology here is that we ask randomly manufacturing companies, Japanese manufacturing companies having at least 3 foreign affiliates, including 1 manufacturing affiliate. So that's the criteria. And we randomly pick up and then send around 1,000 questionnaires to all the headquarters in Japan. And then main response rate is something like 50–60%, so it's very high. And maybe key respondents include automobile, chemical sector, or electronics industry, machinery industry, and there are also others, but it's very diverse. And also the company size is from the real big ones and the SMEs. So it's very wide range, neutral survey on a specific criteria. So based on that, we rank the countries in terms of their preference rate got for each country. And then Vietnam naturally came to rank 4 at this year. And it's constantly keeping the same level because of the factors that you are already aware. So is that enough for the explanation? I hope so.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. And finally, Dr. Lin, to you.
Thank you for the questions.
Sorry, Commandant. We're just going to.
Okay.
Dr. Lin first.
American asked TSMC to invest in American Arizona state. Right now, it's still a mature process products. But now they ask TSMC to invest 3 nanometers. But you know, when the TSMC built the factories in Arizona and the American provided green card for the Taiwan engineers to immigrate to Americans. Few engineers want to go American. And in Taiwan, the TSMC also have the stable supply chains, but they don't want to move their factories to America. So for advanced process products, I mean, it's very difficult. But we all know that Americans want what they want. So we invest, TSMC still invest the 2 nanometers in Hsinchu and 1 nanometers in Taoyuan. This month decided to invest 1 nanometers. So that's why, because the Samsung have no capabilities to produce 2 nanometers or 1 nanometers. But now, because every year, just like the Professor Liu said, TSMC invest many money to budget to do some research. So especially I have to say that because Taiwan Hsinchu have the Jiao Tong University and the Tsinghua University. These 2 universities provide many engineers enter into the TSMC. So if you want to have the human resources, you want to establish the university in the Arizona state or in Japan. So different situations. So that's why I said that it's very difficult to copy TSMC's model to any countries. But still now the India, I mean the India may be the next good place for TSMC to invest in India to produce, because in our scientific park, many Indian engineers over there, especially many Indian engineers work for TSMC.
Thank you very much. Commander Ang, did you have a final comment you wanted to share with us?
I have no comment, but I'm excited with the final questions displayed in the slide. If you would like to give you opportunity to
certainly, I'll give you a moment to answer this online question. So there is an online question for Commander Ang which asks, what role does ASEAN play in recovering Malaysian and other Southeast Asian countries' maritime transportation industry after the COVID-19 pandemic? If you could be brief in your answer as we have to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As one of the coastal states responsible to facilitate the safety of Malacca Straits, together with our neighbor Indonesia and Singapore, under the IMO's convention, Malaysia play important role to make the Malacca Straits safer and cleaner. As we all know, Malacca Straits is one of the busiest streets in the world, in which every year close to 80,000 vessels passing through such a narrow street. And we are also responsible to make the coastal environment safer, to protect the marine species as well as the mangrove plant along the coast of Malaysia. And besides that, we are also responsible to make our port provide better facilitations and provide a cleaner environment for shipping to passing through such an important passage in the east-west navigation routes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll wrap up this session here, and I won't try to summarize our conversation, but just a final observation from me. A discussion on supply chains can feel sometimes quite abstract, but I think we've seen with our contributions from our panelists in our discussion, this is very practical. We are talking about the goods and the products that many of us use and that our economies rely on. And beyond that, particularly with semiconductors, we have a sector which is of great strategic importance. Xi Jinping may not wake up in the morning thinking about TSMC, but the importance of semiconductors is clear to all of us, and perhaps we should all be learning what we can about this industry. So my thanks again to the panelists. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Fu, and thank you, our panelists. And now please be seated for our concluding sessions will be commenced. And for these sessions, may I have the honor to invite Dr. Phạm Lan Dung, Acting President of the DAV, to come on stage to deliver the closing remark.
Excellencies, the microphone is working? Yes. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, participants, and guests. The 14th South China Sea Conference with the theme Peaceful Sea, Solid Recovery has nearly come to an end. Even though I'm lucky enough not to be imposed by the 10 minutes constraint like others, I do not intend to give a long speech, since I believe that each of you sitting here or attending the conference online can have your own takeaways. But I will do my best to highlight what we can learn from our 2 days full of insightful discussion. I saw that the South China Sea is facing turbulences from all directions, from big powers competition, effects from other global hotspots, to hybrid maritime challenges, new grounds where rules of the roads are not yet established, as long as a long-standing question of sustainability versus development. But from that, we also see that the South China Sea is not about a single, but a connected maritime area, being tied to other security hotspots, to bigger concept of blue economy, to the rule-based order, to other oceans where our global partners can find interested in. The South China Sea is indeed interconnected and a connector in the Indo-Pacific. Over the 8th session, we talked a lot about challenges, but also explored different opportunities and ways to overcome those challenges. More important, there are hopes that can be delivered from our mutual commitment to the rule of law, from all sorts of cooperation, be it multi or minilateral, under, on, or above the water surface, and from the suggestions that our experts have put forward in the past 2 days. I can also see such hopes from the wide attendance, from the young participants and from the Vietnamese people abroad in the 2 sidelight events. Even before the final session, I have been receiving a lot of positive feedbacks and congratulations on the success of the South China Sea Conference. It was my pleasure when one of the ambassador participants told me that he was so impressed with our conference and had made 8 tweets in a day about conference. Thank you very much for all of your support and encouragement. And I think that it's now time for me to officially declare that the conference has been successfully completed. And I think that there is a broad consensus that we have had 2 days of substantive, open, and useful discussions. I hope that all of you have witnessed the main message of our conference, that we can still live in harmony even though the world and each of us have just gone through the hardship of the COVID-19, and we are still facing many complexities and challenges at present and in the way ahead. And for that, I especially want to express my gratefulness to all of you. First, I would like to thank all ambassadors and moderators for their commitment, enthusiasm, and professionalism. Hosting in-person seminars is already difficult, and it even more so when hosting hybrid formats with both in-person and online speakers, participants, and even online moderators. However, thanks to your effectiveness management, the sessions have gone smoothly and vibrantly, with much insightful discussion in such a limited time. You all have done great work, and like His Excellency Ambassador Stale hilariously mentioned, you all deserve not one but double awards in our heart of being our best friend at the DAV and being the best moderators among all ambassadors. My sincere appreciation goes to all speakers for your inclusive, insightful, and professional presentations, both to those who traveled on the way to make it to Vietnam, as well as those in other time zones who had to stay up late or get up early to participate in our conference. I appreciate the young leaders, reporters, journalists who have participated in and reported on the conference. I am impressed that young leaders, many attending an international conference for the first time, have confidently expressed their views toward our discussed topics. And it is honor of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam to have all distinguished guests to join hands in our open and constructive discussions. I would like to sincerely thank our partner organizations and embassies who have supported us in the organizations of this conference, especially CAS Vietnam, the Asia-New Zealand Foundation, the Enhancing Security Cooperation in and with Asia project, Petro Vietnam, and the Embassy of Australia, UK, Canada, Czech Republic, EU delegation, embassies of France and Germany. Your support and encouragement has given us confidence and raised scale and the quality of our conference. I would like to thank the city of Da Nang for always being so supportive and being an excellent host whenever the DAV hold our events under your jurisdiction. And lastly, I would like to thank all of my colleagues at the ISI Institute of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for their dedicated and enthusiastic cooperation so that the first South China Sea Conference in Da Nang after 2 years online was held so successfully. Thanks all of my colleagues at the ISI Institute for devotedly taking care of the delegates, discussions, technical, administrative, and many other behind-the-scene work. And I would like to invite all of you to give my colleagues at the ISI Institute a big applause, who are led by my Vice President, Dr. Nguyễn Hùng Sơn, and the ISI Institute Director General, Professor Nguyễn Lan Anh. Please. So last, I wish all you good health and hope to see you once again here in person next year for our 15th conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phạm Lan Dung. And I believe this is also what the organizers of the 14th South China Sea Conference want to say to you all. And once again, thank you, our delegates, moderator, distinguished speakers. Thank you, our participants, even online or offsite. And we'll be seeing you very soon in our future events.